Peptides are more popular than ever. Popular news sources, YouTube channels, influencers. The trend has grown significantly since we started discussing the science behind them a few years ago. But for those not initiated, I'm going to run through pretty much every class of popular peptides, their proposed benefits, and plausible risks. Let it be known the landscape of peptides is vast, not only in plausible potential, but also in knowledge gaps. And for those new here to my channel, I'm passionate about learning as much about these peptides as I can, but I hold that just as we assess theoretical benefit based off limitations in research, the same should be done with theoretical risk. It's my opinion that empowerment through knowledge requires looking at both sides of the same coin rather than blindly diving in. So this will be more of a speed run through the major classes. For full breakdowns on every peptide, check out my channel. There I look at all the data I can get my hands on to dissect what we know and what we don't, and so my goal for this video is to balance simplicity with science, so let's just try it out. Here's a chart I made that should hopefully help you understand what these peptides do, how they're connected, and how they're not. Let's start with the growth hormone secretagogues. These are the peptides that draw a lot of people to the space, myself included. Growth hormone, although its utility as we age is controversial, can be increased through two main categories of peptides. First are the growth hormone releasing hormone, or the GHRH analogs. These work the most upstream. By that I mean the hypothalamus secretes growth hormone releasing hormone, which binds its receptors, and the pituitary, which therein signals release of growth hormone. This then tells the liver to produce IGF-1, the downstream mediator affecting tissues like bone, fat, and muscle. These particular peptides are Tesamorelin, CJC-1295, and Sermorelin. Of the three, Tesamorelin is currently FDA approved for HIV-associated lipodystrophy, or dysregulated adipose tissue production seen in the disease. Sermorelin was FDA approved a long time ago and later discontinued by the FDA for reasons other than safety or efficacy, which of course begs the question of financial incentive. And a fun fact about CJC-1295 is that it's oftentimes produced alongside a DAC, a drug affinity complex that prolongs its half-life significantly, likely somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes, all the way to approximately 6 to 8 days. Now, when we work our way down the pathway, the stomach produces a hormone called Ghrelin that acts at growth hormone secretagogue receptors. Now, a few compounds stimulate this particular action, such as Ipamorelin, GHRP2, and GHRP6. And even though MK677 or ibutamorin is technically not a peptide, it acts within the same class. Now, when we're discussing the most downstream products in this same axis, it's the IGF-1 analogs, peptides that bypass growth hormone entirely and deliver the end product directly. Native IGF-1 circulates bound to IFGBPs, or IGF binding proteins, which extend its half-life and also limits its bioavailability. The analogs were engineered to get around this, essentially. IGF-1 LR3 is an extended form with an arginine substitution that dramatically reduces its affinity for binding proteins, meaning more of it stays free and active, and interestingly, this actually results in faster clearance from circulation, not slower, but the trade-off is greater tissue delivery and potency. IGF-1 DES takes a different approach. It's a truncated version that's missing the first few amino acids, which similarly reduces binding protein affinity and makes it roughly 10-fold more potent than native IGF-1 in cell culture. Both analogs have been studied for anabolic effects across muscle, gut, and other tissues, but neither is FDA approved and both sit on WADA's prohibited list. The appeal is obvious: direct IGF-1 receptor activation without relying on your own GH secretion, but the risks track accordingly. As you can see, all these products either augment secretion of growth hormone itself or the end product of its production, IGF-1. Common concerns associated with doing so are changes in lipid profiles, possible insulin resistance, water retention, and cancer growth. The cancer-related claim is popularly controversial but plausible, given increased IGF-1 is a well-established figure tied to different types of malignancies. So while it can't be said with confidence that these peptides cause cancer, for the most part they're quite short-acting, there's reason to consider the idea that if somebody has something budding, they could stimulate its growth. Now let's segue into peptides notable for healing and recovery. BPC-157 and TB-500 comprise the Wolverine stack, and they're among the most popular in forum discussion publications and within the mainstream media. I've seen countless celebrities talking about them too. BPC-157's one whose body of literature stems almost entirely from preclinical animal data, the vast majority of which comes from a single research group out of Croatia. And while some people find this a non-starter, I worry about the integrity of data given reproducibility of benefit comes from the same list of names, a possible peer-reviewed echo chamber in a way. That said, within this research, it's shown a myriad of healing benefits tied to fistulas, corneal wounds, musculoskeletal injuries, and an odd relationship with cancer. While some of the data outlines a possible mechanism by which it's anti-cancerous, it's known to promote increased expression of vascular endothelial growth factor, and I've made several videos detailing this interaction as well as others. And while some of the data outlines a possible mechanism by which BPC is anti-cancerous, it's known to promote increased expression of vascular endothelial growth factor, or VEGF, which is notable for angiogenic effects. This means it's good at creating new supplies of blood flow to sources of injury, and although excellent for wound healing, this characteristic is also tied closely and repeatedly to cancer spread. So while we can't say it causes cancer, we also can't rule out the possibility that it could promote expansion of something already growing or under the surface, and our inability to answer that question is clouded by the fact that over 75% of available data comes from this same research group. VEGF is a researched target of anti-cancer therapy due to its known ties, and I'm under the impression that there's no such thing as a free lunch. TB500 is thought to act in a way similarly, in a way differently, angiogenically and anti-apoptotically, which means it also protects against programmed cell death, a typically healthy and normal process, which although beneficial in some contexts as you can imagine, it's also questionable in others, like with cancer as well. If the body has trouble recognizing dysregulated cell production, it can harm its ability to declutter and decrease risk of aberrant cell production. But the biggest issue I have with TB500 is the discombobulated way in which it's marketed. It's technically a 7 amino acid fragment of a larger molecule called TB4, thymosin beta-4, which has a larger body of research. But if you look up data on the 7 amino acid fragment, two things are essentially repeated: that it's the segment of the larger compound dedicated to angiogenesis and hair follicle growth. However, when you trace back the claim, you're brought to just repeated claims rather than data suggesting this is the case, a phenomenon known in research as citation laundering. It's like you're in a maze where every turn takes you back to the starting point. Not to mention, some compound pharmacies sell TB4 and call it TB500, while others sell the 7 amino acid fragment and market it that way, creating an ecosystem where confusion is baked into the claim itself. Now, TB500 and thymosin alpha-1 both fall under the thymosin umbrella, but they're fundamentally different molecules. The thymosin family was originally isolated from thymic tissue back in the 60s and 70s as researchers tried to understand how the thymus gland influenced immune development and ended up identifying a whole family of peptides with diverse functions. TB500 is a fragment of thymosin beta-4, which sits in this beta fraction tied to tissue repair, cell migration, and angiogenesis. Thymosin alpha-1 comes from the alpha fraction and is completely separate 28 amino acid peptide with legitimate clinical footprint. It's approved in over 30 countries, not in the US, for conditions like hepatitis B and C, and as an immune adjuvant in certain cancers. Thymosin alpha-1 is predominantly immunomodulatory, seen to do things like enhancing T-cell maturation, dendritic cell function, and shifting immune response towards Th1 activity. Simply put, it acts in a way as to shift the immune system into a homeostatic balance. It's been studied in contexts ranging from viral infections to vaccine enhancement to sepsis. So while they share the thymosin name and both originate from thymic tissue, TB4 and thymosin alpha-1 sit in completely different lanes. TB500 in the regenerative space with its preclinical and research-derived limitations, and thymosin alpha-1 one with actual multinational approvals and decades of clinical investigation, though still lacking the same FDA level of clearance in the States. GHK-Cu is named for its amino acid structure, glycine, histidine, lysine, which is bound to copper. It's a naturally occurring tripeptide that declines with age and has been studied for its role in wound healing, collagen synthesis, and gene expression modulation. It's thought to influence hundreds of genes tied to tissue remodeling and antioxidant response. Together with BPC-157 and TB500, it forms what's known as the GLOW blend, a popular combo in the gray market targeting skin, gut, and musculoskeletal repair. Add KPV to the mix and you get what's called the KLOW stack. I've got deep dives into each of these peptides on my channel. The links will be below. Now, one of the popular concerns with these stacks, by the way, is copper's stability in GHK-Cu, specifically whether this copper ion might degrade or interfere with the other peptides when combined. I actually have a deep dive discussing how likely it is for copper to destabilize these peptide combinations, and the findings may be surprising and even reassuring to many, so I'll link that below too. Now let's talk about the melanocortins, a family of peptides that act on, of course, melanocortin receptors, of which there are 5 subtypes scattered throughout the body. The most popular in this space are Melanotan I, Melanotan II, PT141, and KPV, and while they share a common lineage, their applications diverge quite a bit. MT1 is also known as Afamelanotide. It's FDA approved for a rare condition called erythropoietic protoporphyria, where patients experience severe phototoxic reactions to sunlight. It works by binding to the MC1 receptor on melanocytes, stimulating melanin production, which provides a layer of photoprotection. Interestingly, it predominantly enhances eumelanin, which is the UV absorbent type, rather than pheomelanin, which is photounstable and potentially carcinogenic. So it's not about getting darker, there's a protective element to it. And unlike its unregulated cousin MT2, afamelanotide has shown a favorable safety profile over years of clinical study with no evidence at this point that it increases melanoma risk. MT2 is popular in tanning culture and bodybuilding communities. It's a synthetic analog of alpha-MSH, but structurally it's a shortened cyclic version of MT1 with broader receptor affinity. And it's that broader affinity that's part of the problem. While MT1 predominantly hits the MC1 receptor, MT2 also activates the MC3, MC4, and MC5 receptors, which is why users report effects on libido and appetite alongside the tanning properties. The concern is that MT2 is associated with case reports of melanocytic changes, new or changing moles, and even melanomas emerging during or shortly after use. There are multiple reports demonstrating such. Causation hasn't been definitively established, but multiple national health organizations have issued warnings, and dermatologists are increasingly aware that unexpectedly tanned patients with rapidly pigmenting nevi might be using these compounds. PT141 or Bremelanotide is also FDA approved. It's sold as Vyleesi for hypoactive sexual desire disorder in premenopausal women. Now, rather than primarily targeting the MC1 receptor for pigmentation, it acts on the melanocortin 4 receptor in the hypothalamus, which is an area of the brain tied to sexual function, where it's thought to also increase dopamine release and modulate the excitatory pathways involved with sexual response. Common side effects are nausea and transient increases in blood pressure, and it's worth noting the FDA label specifically states it's not indicated for men, though that hasn't really stopped off-label interest. Then there's KPV, the C-terminal tripeptide fragment of alpha-MSH. What's interesting here is that KPV retains the anti-inflammatory properties of the parent hormone but lacks the pigmentary effects. So rather than being thought of as a classic skin-darkening melanocortin, much of the interest revolves around anti-inflammatory activity through these different pathways like NF-kappa B and MAPK, lowering pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and IL-1 beta. Much of the interest has centered on gut health, and an interesting finding is that in inflamed intestinal tissue, the PEP-T1 transporter becomes upregulated, and KPV can use this pathway to enter epithelial and immune cells, as if it's specific for damaged colonic tissue. In rodent colitis models, oral KPV reduced inflammation and and improved tissue markers, and it's also been studied for antimicrobial and wound healing effects. So while the mechanistic rationale is compelling, we're still extrapolating from animal and cell culture work, however, obviously quite an interesting peptide. A faction of peptides much more lucidly outlined in the literature, of course, as they're supported by big pharma as well, are the GLP-1 agonists. These come from the same family, although act a bit differently. Semaglutide, Ozempic, and Wegovy brought them to the mainstream through decreased central appetite signaling, delayed gastric emptying, increased insulin secretion, and decreased glucagon release, which together improve metabolic profiles and decrease the desire to eat in multiple ways. Tirzepatide also stimulates GIP receptors, thought to possess a synergistic improvement in these mechanistic features. And while Retatrutide does both of these things, it also agonizes or stimulates glucagon receptors, thought to increase energy output, hence its clinical studies showing a more profound weight loss than its progenitors. Of the three, Semaglutide and Tirzepatide are FDA approved, while Retatrutide remains in clinical trials, however it's moving right along in different contexts. Notable concern for all of them is muscle loss, which, while expected given the caloric restriction that comes with decreased appetite and significant weight loss, it's something to consider alongside the benefits, especially for those who value body composition alongside the number on the scale. The risks of these are popular and common, the biggest of which is gastrointestinal upset, manifests in different ways, whether nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, or even the inverse, constipation. And now we have the bioregulators, a class of small peptides, typically just 3 to 4 amino acids, that were pioneered by the late Dr. Vladimir Kavinson out of Russia. The concept behind them is that these short peptide sequences are derived from specific tissues, and they're thought to regulate gene expression within those same tissues, essentially signaling repair and restoration in a targeted way. Epitalon, for instance, is a tetrapeptide derived from the pineal gland and is claimed to influence telomerase activity and circadian regulation. Pinealon is another one tied to neurological function. The challenge here is that much of the foundational research exists in Russian literature that hasn't been widely translated or replicated in Western journals, so the evidence base is difficult to fully assess. That said, I am currently digging through a lot of that original Kavinson research on Epitalon specifically, uncovering the Russian studies, so stay tuned and subscribe for an upcoming deep dive where we'll uncover what the data actually shows, and it's quite surprising. I hope you enjoyed this video. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch. The best way to support a small peptide YouTuber is a like and subscribe. It goes a very long way and I'd certainly appreciate it. On top of that, I do have a Patreon available for those interested in supporting the channel further and engaging within this community online. I'll link that below so you can take a look, decide if it's something for you. Either way, I appreciate the time. I hope you have a great day. See you soon. Take care.
Cut to the chase, evidence-based. Pull up a chair, let's get this straight. Peptide buddy, he's your peptide buddy.